and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the novelist and non-fiction writer Hisham Matar.
We spoke to Hisham about his early life in Libya and Egypt, about the abduction of his father in 1990, how it shaped his development, and about his new novel, My Friends.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Hisham, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with your latest novel, My Friends? You've said that the idea, a very simple 2-line idea for a book about 3 male friends who end up in different places, it came to you years ago when you were writing In the Country of Men. When did you decide it was the right time to put pen to paper?
It didn't really feel like a decision, I think what happened was that there was this accumulation of ideas, really, a way to sort of know how to approach that. I wasn't convinced that I knew how to approach it. And then after the Arab Spring, that sort of added another layer to it, because I thought it would be very interesting to somehow have my characters involved in that, or at least touched by it in some way, because one of the things that I was interested in was questions of temperament. And it seems to me that if you want to write a novel about friendship, temperament is quite important. And the novel is a very good place for temperament. So to have that set against something as stark as a political rupture, then I thought that would be quite interesting.
It's not the only theme in the novel, but male friendship is a sort of central area that you look at. Do you think that's a subject matter that is maybe underserved by contemporary literature? Is it something that books and writers should be engaging with and wrestling with more?
I mean, I'm not sure about that, but I just know that I haven't encountered it in the ways that I wanted to write about it. So it felt like it would be quite an interesting challenge. I think, I don't know why, really. I don't know why I write the books I write, but I think in part it's to do... Several things are involved. I think I think writing on some level is in praise of all the books that have touched us, But it's also a desire to write something that I haven't read, And I haven't read something like this. I haven't read this kind of portrait of male friendship. So you're right, it's not something that at least has been written about a lot, and I don't know why.
It's structured around a walk that Khaled takes across London. How early on in the writing process did that framing device take shape in your mind as the way that you wanted to tell the story?
Fairly early on. The first thing I had was the first page, and I had it for about a decade before I wrote the book. And I didn't really know who was talking or why he was feeling what he was feeling so intensely. But that opening, it is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own or those we know well, perhaps especially those we know best. But, and it carries on. That was turning in my head for a long time, really, And I felt it had all the clues in it. The way it starts, it is, of course, impossible. It sounds like it's mid-sentence, like somebody this is part of an ongoing conversation. So it already felt incredibly intimate, the voice. But also that it was one of the things that the book is interested in is this complicated distance between what we hold within us and how we express it. The evidence of our true feelings, how unfaithful or inexact they sometimes are or can be. And I felt that that's actually, in some ways, for me, that's one definition of what literature is. It exists in that space, between the language before language, the things that we feel that don't have words, that we have to strive to translate, and the ways that we succeed and fail in expressing them, And so that was in my mind. And the fact that he was standing in a train station, but, the sentence continues, but as I stand here on the upper level of King's Cross Station, from where I can monitor my old friend Hisham Matar walking across the concourse. And I thought, that's interesting. It's a farewell. And farewells have always, I'm not unique, of course, farewells have always moved me, I'm talking about genuinely powerful relationships, people that you really don't want to part ways with. At the same time, can't wait to part ways with because it's unbearable. The parting is so unbearable, you can't wait for it to be done with. And the way the air shifts immediately after that. And you're both melancholy, perhaps, but also sort of excited, especially sort of left alone in the city, All of that seemed fascinating to me. And then I thought, well, how to extend that state, how to have the whole book told in that state, and where I could continue thinking about some of the subjects that have fascinated me right from the start in my work, questions of how time resides in the moment, how it's linear and circular, how it can be, there are certain moments, temporal moments that are flat and almost as inhospitable as a polished marble surface, but also other ones that are very porous and where we feel that there are so many different layers of time in them. So all that relationship, that complex relationship that we all have to negotiate in any lived moment, right, between the present and the past and our expectations or yearnings for the future, all of that felt that a structure where someone is walking back home. So, the place from which he just left with his friend to take him to the station. That circular structure felt quite clear to me right from the beginning. And the book was written into the structure, I don't work by writing and then figuring out the structure. The structure is very much the vehicle into which the book is written, with which the book is written. So there's a great process of initiation, at least, that's how it feels like in the beginning, learning what this voice wants, why this tone, what are the clues in it, what can happen within that structure, what are the things that I can do and what are the things that I can't do, Those were the early questions that sort of accompanied me for a while, whilst I sort of had a go and then would stop and go write another book and then come back to have a go and write. I wrote The Return and then I wrote A Month in Siena and then I came back. And then by then I felt I knew quite a lot about the book. And also enough time had passed between the events of the Arab Spring, where I also was very embroiled and had, very strong feelings about. And in order to write a novel like this, I needed to develop some kind of distance from it. It's not the right way of putting it, but a kind of passionate ambivalence towards those events, so I can really inhabit them in a different way and have them be filled with doubt and contradiction. And so that's how it started.
A question that we always put to our novelist guests on the show is kind of similar to what you were alluding to in your previous answer about how they go about constructing their plots. So whether in the vernacular we often hear they're a plotter, so someone who has everything kind of organised before they go in, or a plunger, so someone who goes in and follows their nose. And it sounds like you're in some ways towards the second, but we also were struck in a comment you'd made elsewhere that you sometimes use a kind of approach from your architectural training here of putting pages up on the wall. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about how your kind of process for building a book works.
It's a very interesting question, and it's one that is both easy to answer but difficult to describe accurately, because I think if I have to say how things start, or the most abiding sort of structural approach, it would be questions of intention, so when the book comes, again, all this language is problematic, I understand, but when I have that first page, I feel one of the things that page contains is a certain kind of attitude or character. And then suddenly my intention, I have a choice. I can have the intention of following that character, almost like a sort of half-remembered dream. Or I can dominate it and take it somewhere else that suits my fancy. That seems to me a very clear choice in the beginning. And I'm much more interested in the first approach. And so that intention is really what accompanies me. And I write and I continue working for a while. I need to have anywhere between 30 to 50% of the book before I feel that I know where I'm going. And with this book, because it's quite a big book, that meant, a good 200 pages. And once I had those 200 pages, I knew that they contain a lot of what the book is about, but I also knew that they had problems with them. And so at that stage, I print them and I put them across the wall, chronological order. So, or in this case, several walls. And then what that does is it gives me a visual image of the book. I can see how much space something takes and where its location is. And I could make notes and I could see echoes, certain themes that keep repeating, or certain words or certain images. And it's not that I'm necessarily editing, it's just that I am learning more about the book. Also beside reading it and doing all the usual things, but that's just something that visually helps me. It also, I think, has a psychological purpose, if I'm to be honest, because it makes me feel less bewildered. I feel that, it's up there, I can look at it, I can see what I've done. And then also, given that usually happens at the stage when I'm really stuck or confused, have no idea where to go next, the visual presence of it in my day is somehow helpful. I'm not sure why, but it's sort of there,
You mentioned that it's not for editing purposes, at that point. When do you then go in and revise? Is that after you've got a complete manuscript?
At that stage, that for me at least happens sort of, a quarter or a third into to halfway into the book. I feel that by then the demands of the book are quite clear to me. And then things switch. I become more in service. I'm sort of turning up to work every day with a set of things that I'm required to do, And so that involves rewriting, a lot of rewriting. I write usually the first draft by hand, and then I am transcribing and printing and it goes in circles like that. And so I'm doing a lot of rewriting. I spend much more time redrafting and rewriting and then writing. And the rewriting is also writing, because suddenly you add something else. And so I'm doing that all the time. I'm writing and editing and redrafting and rewriting in a circular kind of pattern all the while. And every time I sit down to work, I'm reading from the beginning. Of course, after a while, that becomes impossible. But then I read sort of, the last, whatever it is, 70 pages or so. And then as I'm reading those 70 pages, the first thing I do in the morning, I am also inevitably making changes in editing and so on. So I'm combing through it all the time. So as by the end, when I've finished a book, I've probably read it, over 100 times or more, the whole thing, and sections of it more than that. But then when it's done, when I feel I have a draft, I put it down for about 6 weeks, and I do something else. I try to do something very involving. I write something, or write an essay or something, or I travel, or, just to refresh somehow my mind and my eyes. And then when I go back to it it usually takes me about 6 weeks. When I go back to it after 6 weeks, I feel, at least, or the myth that I sustain is that I am objective, and I can really be better at getting rid of things that I'm perhaps attached to for the wrong reason, or seeing holes, things that need to be developed or introduced. And that, so I would work on that. It usually takes about 3 months with a book of this size, and then I put it down again for 6 weeks, and then I go back to it again. I do that about 3 or 4 times before I send it to my editor. I want to be in a place where I feel I've done all I can. Of course, you can never do all you can, but I've done most of what I can, and that I'm really very deeply acquainted with its structure and its tone and all of its character. So for me, from finishing a novel, it usually takes me about a year before I would show it to anyone.
We wanted to come back to My Friends in due course, but could we roll back now to your early life? So you were born in New York, your family moved back to Tripoli in 1973, but left again for Cairo in 1979. What do you remember of those formative early years in Libya?
So much, so much. It was such a vivid time. All the registers, the social life was very vibrant, and it had many cousins and friends and a large family with lots of gatherings and lots of gossip and people falling out and people making up. But also it was very sensuous because we lived right by the sea. I spent a lot of time in that sea. Yeah, so it was just very, very rich, and it was interrupted in a very sudden and frightening way that I'm sure that interruption has, sweetened it in my mind. I'm sure of that, and it's also been, as a writer, it's been one of the things I watch out for, whenever I write about it, as I did in The Return, not to essentialize it, At the same time, and this is the contradiction, believing that something about that experience, about it being interrupted like that, has made my perceptions of it more vivid and I believe more exact, more objective, that I think had I stayed there like my cousins, the vividness of that period of my life from 3 to 9 would have been, revised by everything else that would have happened afterwards.
And when did you become cognizant of having an interest in literature? I read somewhere that your father encouraged you to memorize poems. Is that right?
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was promoting it to me because he was very good at it. And he really thought that the best way to know a piece of text is to commit it to memory. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, that's partly why that first page that I wrote, I did commit to memory, because I felt this is something I want to carry with me. and think about. And for part of the year I teach literature classes, and I focus a lot on close reading. And when I really want to encourage my students to look at a particular passage, we all commit it to memory, because there's something about doing that you have to search for the connections. So you could remind yourself what comes next, what's the next sentence, where does that phrase fall? So yes, he had encouraged me to do that. And I started writing very early on. I mean, not seriously, of course, I was just fooling about, but I never met anyone who had made a living writing. I had an uncle who was a poet, but he had this job, he worked for the United Nations, and I just thought, I didn't know that you could actually be a writer.
Could you tell us about the kind of key moves in your early life? So going to England for school in 1986, studying architecture, and then, the move towards becoming a published writer, and then also where your father's abduction in 1990 fitted into your experiences and your development throughout this time.
Yes, I came to England in 86. I went to school for the first 3 years of that, and then I went to university and studied architecture and worked as an architect. It was really my first training, it was really, I felt it involved me. It was actually, I think it was a very good subject to study because it involves you in close looking and also in the history of ideas. My father was kidnapped from his home in Cairo by the Libyan dictatorship when I was in 1990. So I was 19. It was second year at university. It's very hard now to sort of give you a quick impression of what that was like, and it's why I wanted to write about it in the return, really, because it was such a seismic event that touched everything, but I couldn't mention it to anyone. I couldn't share it with anyone because it was frightening, and I didn't know whether it would, place him in more danger if I spoke about it. Anyway, and so it cast me into a strange solitude, because although I wasn't alone, I had friends at university, and I was very much alone in it. Yeah.
Could we talk now about In the Country of Men, your debut novel published in 2006? Am I right in thinking that it began life as a poem, and what you originally envisaged as 12 lines and 4 weeks of work became 5 years? Is that something, again, that was quite organic rather than a sort of active decision to turn it into a novel?
Absolutely. I had started writing what I thought was a poem about a boy tasting mulberries for the first time. And it very quickly was clear that it was prose and it wasn't a poem, it was narrative. And then I called it a short story for the first 50,000 words. Yeah, and that book really taught me a lot, it trained me. And I didn't have an agent or a publisher. And I really only had one reader, it was my wife, Diana, she's a very, very good reader, and she was a much more evolved artist by then. She's a visual artist, a photographer, and she really was deep in her practice, by then. So I learned a lot from her, just by observing how she negotiated the world and her work, questions of discipline, questions of how deeply engaged she was in the ideas that surrounded her work. And so I was writing this alone, and I would sometimes give her things to read, and this went on for about 4 years, until the book was done. But in that time, it exacted a whole revolution in my life, because I thought, up to then, I thought I really cared about writing. But what was going on was that writing was in the periphery of my life. In the center was my architectural work. And I would write around it. I'd write early in the morning, I'd write in the evenings, I'd write on the weekends. And then very slowly, upturned everything. My architectural practice closed, and I began looking for work that I could fit around my writing. Things that weren't intellectually demanding and that didn't take a lot of my time. So I started painting houses, and then I started a small bookbinding company, with binding these beautiful sketchbooks with cotton-based Italian paper, Flaiano paper, that I would take and have it bound by hand in these wonderful binders in Cairo, who are now quite well known, and sell them. So I would do anyway. I would do various different things, and in order to support my writing. So it was quite. That book really, I feel, led all of that. It imposed its demands. And I think that's why I feel that I'm not really. My attitude to writing isn't as a careerist. Obviously I would love to do it for the rest of my life. I do believe it's my vocation. I do think it's the best thing I know how to do. It's the thing that I enjoy most and want to carry on doing. But I'll do it only if I have a book, and so far it seems that every time I'm working on a book, about halfway through, I have an idea for another one. So as long as this carries on, it's a delight, but I'm not gonna carry on writing if I don't have one, So all of this to say is that I don't feel that I have a lot of choice. I have choice, but it's a limited choice. The choice is to write it or not to write it. I don't feel I have a choice of, I want to go write. I have these 6 books in front of me and I'm going to choose which one to write. It certainly doesn't work that way with me.
We really like on the podcast to get into the mechanics of how people initially got published, got particularly their first book deal and so forth. So with yourself, with In the Country of Men, how did you go about getting an agent and then subsequently getting a publishing deal for it?
I had early on, when I wrote still handwritten pages of In the Country of Men, I showed them to David Dabadine. I didn't know him personally, but I knew his work. I'd read Turner, that wonderful poem by him, and I've read a couple of his novels. And I was very, very impressed by, particularly his poetry. I was very, very impressed by it. Still am. I love Turner particularly. Anyway, I thought I should have a writer that I admire and respect read these pages and tell me what he thinks. And there won't be any risk of him flattering me or worrying about my feelings because we have a friend in common or whatever. I would just, So I went to David and gave him those pages, and I said, I'd like you to, I wonder if you, could read them and tell me what you really think. And to my surprise, he didn't take the pages and go read them in private. He said to me, okay, sit next to me here. And he sat there and for about 20 minutes read the opening pages of In the Country of Men, written by hand, by pencil. And they were some of the most excruciating 20 minutes of my life, because I thought, which told me something, because I obviously cared so much about this work. And after he finished reading them, he said, this is brilliant. Do you have an agent? And I said to him, no, and naively said, why do I need one? He said, oh, you need an agent, and I think you should send them to my agent. And I went away after that, carried on working on the book, obviously felt really, really happy and moved by his encouragement. But I didn't send it to his agent or to any agent. I didn't know why I didn't want to, but now I do. It's really that I didn't feel that I had the confidence or the experience to be able to resist a compelling proposition, somebody saying, I think you should take your book in that direction. Of course, now I know really good agents and editors would never tell you that. But then I thought, yes, they would suggest, going in this direction or that. And I really didn't want to have to deal with that. I wanted to write it from within my doubts. And so I didn't have an agent or didn't think about getting an agent until I finished it. When I finished it, I sent it to, with a cover letter, I sent the first 25 pages to 3 agents. And the 3 agents, I found them because, and you have to stop me if I'm being more detailed than you wish.
We love detail, don't worry.
I was just echoing Rachel, we love this detail.
So at some point, in this impoverished state when I don't have my architectural practice, I'm hustling in order to write my book. Someone asks me, had seen me, I think, or someone they knew saw me read in a cafe in Cambridge in these sort of poetry reading evenings, and called me up out of the blue, found my number somehow, called me up and said, I'm putting up this play by Naomi Wallace at the Hotbed Theatre Festival in Cambridge, which is a wonderful theatre festival that puts up new plays that are sort of new writing. And would you like to audition for it? I think you'll be right for the part. And I was completely confused because I'm not an actor. He says, I know you're not an actor, but I don't know, I think you might be right for this. And so I jokingly said, will you make me rich and famous? And he laughed. And there was something about his voice that I just thought, he's all right. So I said, okay, fine, I'll go. I was confident, 100% sure I won't get the part, but I thought it would be fun. Why not? So I took the train to Cambridge and auditioned for this. And I got the part. And it's a monologue, an hour on stage alone. And it just was, it won the festival prize. It moved to London, and I did a run at it was called the Latchmere Theatre then, in Battersea, and then it moved to the King's Head. And it really just wiped me out, because I'm not an actor. I didn't have the skills of how to do 7 shows a week and still be able to function. I naively thought they'll pay me 250 quid a week. I could survive on that. I could carry on writing all day. And then in the evening, I go and be on stage for an hour. How difficult can that be? And it was horrible because I couldn't sleep from the nerves. Of course, I couldn't write at all. But it was also marvelous because it taught me a lot about language. Naomi Wallace's play, it was called The Retreating World. It was so beautifully written, so carefully structured. And you realize that when you're on stage, certain words become your anchor, especially when you're doing a monologue. Certain words in that script held me in place. I knew there were islands that I went to. And I feel similarly with prose, Part of that experience, I met some wonderful people. One of them was Hanif Qureshi. He came to the play and he really liked it. And he said, listen, people here are telling me that you're not really an actor, that you're a writer. I said, well, I'm not even sure I am that. I'm writing a novel, but I don't know what will happen with it. And he said, well, when you finish it, let me know. And so when I finished it, I wrote him and I said, I finished my novel. He said, send it to my editor at Faber and Faber, Lee Braxton. So I sent it to Lee. Lee read it and called me in. And this was an early draft of In the Country of Men. And he was just really wonderful and very enthusiastic about the novel. And he said, you need to find an agent. And I said, can you recommend someone? And he said, yeah, I could recommend 3 people. And so those were the people that I then got on my bicycle and took my first 25 pages with a cover letter. And Kevin Conroy Scott from what then was Conville and Walsh, he called me up and he said, I love this novel and I want to meet you. And we met and we were both young. It was really our first book, But even then, my expectations were that I would, publish with a really good it's one of the publishers that I admire, literary publishers that I read, But I knew that I would be paid nothing for it. So I was scrambling for a way to carry on writing. And I had applied to an MFA at East Anglia, the creative writing MA at East Anglia, and got a place. And the day that I finished the novel, the final edit that Kevin, my new agent, was going to submit to publishers was on a Friday. And the MA starts on the Monday. And I sent it to him. And of course, I was bewildered because this book had governed my life for 5 years. It meant that my wife and I moved. We left England. We went to Paris for part of the time. I did all these various things. And it felt like it was the governing order, over my life. And it was finished now. I didn't know what to do with myself. And I had this course to go to on Monday. And so, about which I was ambivalent, because I wasn't sure it's the right thing for me. But I thought, if I do it, then I could teach. I could find a way to earn my keep. And anyway, I didn't go on Monday because I was doubtful. Tuesday, I decided I should go because then I could at least, going would help me decide. And I got on the train there. Kevin, my agent, had told me that not to expect to hear anything for at least 6 weeks because it takes a long time for editors to read a book and make a decision. And this was only Tuesday. And I was on the train. It was actually that month that our landlord was a nice man, but he did say, listen, if you don't pay the rent this month, you're going to have to leave. So it was a very stressful time. And I was on the train, and Kevin calls me on the train, and he says, where are you going? And I was too embarrassed to tell him, so I said, I'm just on a train. And he was sounding very chipper, and he said, listen, editor from Scepter walked into their meeting after the weekend and said, I read the book over the weekend and you don't have time to read it. You just have to take my word for it. We need to preempt and buy this book. And Kevin was saying other publishers are reading it and we should open it to an auction. You should call Diana and see what she thinks. Calls me back after 5 minutes. Did you call Diana? I said, no, because I don't have any credit on my phone. So he calls her and gets her to call me, and we decide to follow his advice and go on an auction. Anyway, I get off at Manningtree. There's a wonderful pub on the platform, Manningtree. This is 11 o'clock in the morning. I go in, I order a brandy, I smoke a cigarette, and I go back to London, get on my bicycle and go home. I've never been to and never enrolled in the course. Thankfully, East Anglia forgave me. I went there and gave a lecture, and it's a lovely place. But that's how it happened with me. And it received a very good advance, so it allowed me to write my second book. And, so yeah, I owe a great deal to that book, both in educating me as a writer, but also in making it possible for me to carry on writing.
Jumping ahead a little bit, can we talk about The Return now? You've described it as a book you needed to write, and also one that you needed to get out of the way so that you could really write your novels. Could you tell us a little bit about why you've said that?
I think, before anything, I have to say that I have huge doubts about the person talking now. Because when you're writing a book, that's really when you're an expert on it. And that's exactly the time when you can't talk about it. You can't, at least I can't. And then it's finished, it goes out into the world, then you're talking about it. And it's, you're really in a different place by then. So I'm playing a retrospective kind of game with talking about it, but I don't. All I know is that when I started writing The Return, I really felt it's the book I must write, like with all of them. But this one was, because it was asking me to go to these places that were really very, very difficult. I resisted it, and it felt incredibly urgent and intense. And I used to describe it when I was writing it. I used to describe it like as in standing in a fire. If you are, as long as you're inside the fire, it's fine. But if you're kicked out for any reason, you stop writing, you have to travel, or you lose your way, and then you have to find your way back in. That was the worst, because it was really tough. But then now I think I needed to write it because lots of people around me had this idea that I'm this writer who can write, but also I have a lot of material, that have been through things, and which is true. I have been through things, but I've always been suspicious of that question about material. I think we all have material. I don't think it really matters on some level how. I don't know. I resist the reductive sort of conclusion that if you've been through a lot, then you'll probably write a good book. I don't think that's true at all. And so I thought, well, I'll just put all the material out there and try to organize it.
So we should say for listeners that The Return is your account of returning to Libya in 2012 after more than 30 years to search for the truth about your father.
Yeah, and it's a book really about emergence for me. It's a book about having all of these things that have happened, the disappearance of my father, all the very loud moments in that history, be on the same plane as the very quiet moments, moments of intimacy, moments of engaging with, the most private questions about how to live, and engaging with paintings and with books and with people who are very intimate to me. So I wanted to create this state of emergence right from within an emergency, and it sort of liberated me on some. I'm slightly hesitant in using that word, but I think it did on some level liberate me and allowed me to write a much more playful and experimental book like A Month in Siena, that comes out of a kind of a state of being liberated from any sense of obligation, Not that The Return was written out of obligation, but it was written out of urgency. It was written out of a state of urgency, and emergency at the same time, So yeah.
So we're coming up towards the end of our time limit, and I wanted to ask you now about kind of success, really. So, you've won the Pulitzer Prize, you've been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. After these kind of years of struggle and difficulty, what has that experience of success been like for both good and ill? And kind of fitting in with that, a feature of the podcast is that we always ask guests about money and about how it's interacted with their writing lives. And you've been admirably candid about that so far, particularly when things were tough in that respect. So has that part of your writing life become easier since you've gained these plaudits?
Prizes are tricky because I think it would be foolish not to care about them. It would be foolish not to enjoy them if you're lucky enough to get one, and be thankful and appreciative. I think it would be foolish. But I think it would also be foolish to take them too seriously. I take them to heart, but I try not to let them get to my head because I think, I'll tell you why, because the thing I'm concerned about is that it would redefine what the prize is, because I think the real prize needs to be defined by each writer for herself or himself, no? What is really the prize in writing something? But yes, it makes, winning the Pulitzer Prize, or it certainly makes your writing life, the business of it, a little bit easier. People take your work more seriously, perhaps, and so on. So I'm appreciative but I also know that there are wonderful books that don't get those things. So I also know that it's not an absolute measure. But the money side of things, I still have to do other things. I teach. Writing isn't very lucrative, even when you've had the success that I've had. So I don't know what to say about that, except I think the objective, if you can find a way to work in a way that best suits your work, so keeping always the focus that you're in service of the work, not that the work is in service of you, so that to me has been my North Star, if I can put it that way. So creating the conditions that I can write a book in the way that I want to write it, in the time that I want to write it, that I'm not obliged to deliver it before it's ready, and so on. And these aren't easy things to do. I know that there are lots of pressures to work at someone else's pace, but it seems to me that is the thing to try to do all the time.
As a final question from me, you've been described as Libya's reluctant spokesman, but you've also said that writing only works when you stop using it as a weapon. How do those two things coexist for you, or not?
I mean, I'm not a spokesman for any place or anyone. I've lived the overwhelming majority of my life here. I'm much more a Londoner than I am anything else, as well as a Libyan. And I think writing, the kind of writing I'm interested in, is writing that is as free as possible. I want to write the kind of book that would give me up. And it seems to me that if you're going to use your writing as a weapon, then you're going to have to dominate it. You're going to have to wield it. That seems to me the wrong way around. I want to be wielded by my work. And also, I'm not interested in the language of weapons, so I wouldn't even want to put it that way in sort of the work you wielding me as a weapon. But I want to be in service of it. I want to see what will come with what I'm doing. And I just think that if you're going to be in the territory of being a spokesperson or using something as a weapon, then it's all premeditated. You have to decide what and whom the work is going to serve.
Great. Well, look, thank you for a really fascinating conversation. I'm wishing you all the very best with the publication of the new novel and all your other projects going forward.
Thank you so much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Hisham Matar. He's on Twitter at Hisham J. Matar, and My Friends is published by Viking. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Hisham?
I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was moving and interesting in equal measure. His comments on continually editing and rewriting reminded me a little bit of the conversation we had with William Dalrymple in terms of combing over the previous day's work before moving on. It's obviously not the same because I'm not a novelist and I don't work on anything of that length, but I find that approach as well of putting your work away for a while and coming back to it with fresh eyes very helpful. And as a fellow stationery lover, Simon, I'm sure you enjoyed hearing about the jobs he did while he was writing his debut. I think Binder of Beautiful Books is a first for the podcast.
Well, we had a chat. I can't remember if this was on air or maybe it was off air at the end, where we shared our love for a particular bookbinder in Cairo. So that was a great moment. I was also very touched by his own life story. Obviously, the experience with his father being very difficult, and I also thought it's very interesting on prizes, which is another continuing theme we have. But what his experience with the Pulitzer Prize was, and how that changed in that went from being a kind of difficult and transitory period as he moved from one career to another to setting him on a more even footing. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what have you been consuming culturally?
I have just got back from a lovely long weekend in Northumberland, which was great. I've had a busy few weeks in terms of writing lots, which has been really enjoyable actually, as writing is not the kind of main part of my job. I did a piece in collaboration with Stephen Follows, who's a film data analyst, about just how much sex is on screen these days. Because I'd seen a lot of articles sort of decrying the end of eroticism and kind of wanted to look at it analytically.
But also the return of eroticism with that new Zendaya film, right?
Well, exactly. It seems that everyone was very divided, so I thought I'd do the typical Economist thing of answer it with cold, hard numbers. And it was interesting to see. It's kind of the first article I've done that's been picked up by other publications. So it's been interesting.
What were your findings? What did the cold hard numbers say?
That it's decreased by about 40% since the level of sexual content on screen has decreased by about 40% since 2000. But my thesis was that although there might be fewer scenes, they're more sort of explicit than ever before. There's kind of nothing that you can't show anymore, really. So it was kind of looking at that dualism. Anyway, what have you been up to, Simon?
I'm back in London now, so I've come back after the period in the Alps. So I had, as we were saying off air, I had to do a whole bunch of logistics and putting things into storage and stuff like that, which was kind of exhausting, but was fine. And then came back and have been sleeping quite a lot. But in matters cultural, I finished my interminable Edwardian book on mountaineering. And I'm reading East West Street by Philippe Sands, who we're hoping to have on the podcast later this year, which has been interesting. And again, I was kind of trying to sort of gut it for how he had done this mixture of historical research and contemporary narrative. And I think it's always interesting to read a book where you're trying to like get a sense of how it's been built structurally. It's slightly different from just reading for pleasure. But I've been enjoying that, and also finishing a magazine piece. But yeah, just taking a bit of time to decompress at the moment. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.